Two animal activists entered a factory farm to document cruelty to pigs. They saw two piglets who seemed on the verge of death. They had to do more than take pictures. They rescued the piglets. For doing so, the activists faced up to 10 years in jail. The law went after the activists, not the factory farms. How Direct Action Everywhere, DXE, triumphed in Utah. Next on the PETA Podcast. Welcome to the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo, your host for this inside look at animal rights. Brought to you by PETA, the largest animal rights organization in the world. On today's episode, the ongoing fight against factory farms. It's been a long-standing battle. PETA first began documenting abuses in animal factory farms in the early 1990s. Just this week, a PETA undercover investigator got video at Plainville Farms in Pennsylvania. And seeing was believing. Animals were seen sick, injured, unable to walk, birds left to die in agony, workers pretending to rape a live turkey. Pennsylvania State Police charged 11 former workers with nearly 140 counts of cruelty to animals, including felonies, the largest number of charges in any factory-farmed animal case in U.S. history. We'll see what happens in court. It can be a long march to justice. To prove that, just as that case begins, another case, this one in Utah, involved animal activist Direct Action Everywhere, DXE. They were fighting global giant Smithfield Foods, which uses factory farms in Utah. The Utah case is slightly different because prosecutors didn't go after the factory farm's cruelty. Prosecutors went after the animal rights activist Compassion instead. It was in 2017 when activists Wayne Shung and Paul Picklesheimer went to document the abuse at a factory farm in Utah. They saw two piglets, which were later named Lily and Lizzie. The activists rescued them, but then they were arrested. 5 activists total were arrested and 3 pled out. Now, 5 years later, the trial was held for Shung and Picklesheimer. Jeremy Beckham, local Utah activist and a frequent PETA podcast guest, followed the trial on his Twitter feed at Jeremy Beckham. We talk about how the fight against factory farms has evolved over time. DXE was using high-tech virtual reality headset cameras to document the abuse. But the farm's reaction was typical, as Smithfield and the state attempted to keep everything from public view. To bring attention to the case, DXE staged protests, like storming the field at a Monday night football game in San Francisco. But the biggest change in this case, Smithfield and the factory farms weren't under fire. The good guy activists were, seen as criminal. Here's my conversation with Jeremy Beckham on how the activists sought and found justice on the PETA Podcast. Jeremy Beckham, welcome again to the PETA Podcast in Utah there. Welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, Emil.
Yeah, well, it's always good to have you, especially when you're covering the trial. This is not I don't know if it's a trial of the century, but a lot of people heard about this trial when they saw the beginning of a protester at the Monday night football game about on October 3rd, a guy with a shirt that said "Right to Rescue," and he had a pink flare. He was censored. ESPN censored, would not show the protester. Later on, in some stories and in social media, a young man who claimed to be part of Direct Action Everywhere, DXE, and the whole idea was to call attention to this trial that was beginning last week that you attended. Because of that, do you think there was a lot more attention on this trial?
I definitely think that helped bring attention to, what has been called the Smithfield trial. There's no question that Direct Action Everywhere is very good at getting attention to what they're doing. The attention, though, really started with the incident in question, which was in 2017. Wayne Shung and Paul Picklesheimer, as well as a few other people, walked on to one of the largest pig factory farms in the country, located in Beaver, Utah, and filmed conditions there using sophisticated virtual reality cameras. And they removed 2 piglets from that farm. And this happened back in March of 2017. It was published a few months later by the New York Times, a long piece about it. And that's really when it came to the attention of this farm, which is called Circle 4 Farms. That's the name of this farm. And they alerted the authorities. And not long after, charges were filed. And that's really when the whole saga began. And, I think pretty much ever since that moment, we've had pretty significant attention on this trial.
Yeah, but the idea of the protesters going out before just before halftime of the 49er Rams game on Monday Night Football was because there seems to be an intent to not let anyone know about what's going on. I mean, you talk about the New York Times reporting it 5 years ago, but there seems to be, and maybe it's because it's an animal rights issue, it maybe because it has to do with factory farming, but there was a concerted effort to make sure no one knew about the trial, no one knows about this issue, no one knows about what goes on in factory farms, and DXE said pretty much, well, we're going to take this case to the people. We're going to let people know about it. And why is there that sense that the corporate media, the corporate farming, the corporate interests don't want people to know about what was going on there in Utah and about this trial?
Well, I tell you, in my experience, every animal abusing industry out there thrives in secrecy. They all need secrecy in order to conduct their business, because they know that if the public really understood how animals were being routinely tortured, whether it's on factory farms, in animal experimentation labs, on fur farms, they would be horrified, and the calls for change would only grow louder. And, it's a pattern that goes back literally since the beginning of the animal rights movement, actually. And we see it with things like ag-gag laws. If we didn't have brilliant legal minds working to overturn these laws, Wayne and Paul would have undoubtedly been charged with an additional crime just for taking photographs and videos there that day. That used to be a separate criminal offense in Utah until it was struck down in 2014. So you had ag-gag laws. Even here in this trial, you had the state saying that Wayne and Paul could not show any of the photographs or video that they captured there at that factory farm because it would, quote, induce horror in the jury and lead them to come to a prejudiced outcome, because they'd be so angry at what they saw in the video and photo, they wouldn't be able to reach a fair-minded verdict about the burglary charge.
And yet, the claim was the jury would be prejudiced against the truth if they saw the truth?
Exactly, because, the jury there, the legal theory is that the jury is there that day only to decide if a burglary occurred or if a theft occurred, not there to decide on the overall ethics about what Smithfield was doing or a factory farming or any of these other questions. But what's really crazy is that those videos and those photographs actually depict the crime in question. And, typically in a criminal trial, actually, these roles are reversed. You usually have the defense team urging the court to suppress evidence that incriminates their client. In this case, you have the prosecution moving to suppress that evidence, frankly, because it incriminates our whole damn system of animal agriculture. And they didn't want the jury, and they didn't want the broader public, for that matter, to see this material.
So no one saw the jury did not see the video, and the public hasn't seen the video?
Well, the public has seen the video through some of the media coverage. The New York Times posted a link to it. And, I believe the video is called Operation Death Star.
Right.
If anyone out there would like to look that up, I think it's on YouTube. And if you ever have access to one of these VR headsets, I've done it myself. I've put on the headset and looked at it in 360 degrees. And, it's remarkable. You feel like you're actually there in this hellhole. You can look up and see the ceiling and down and look at the feces covered floor. And the defense actually moved to bring in headsets for each juror so they could actually be placed at the scene of the, quote, crime for themselves, that seems like that would be the most fair thing to do in a criminal trial. But obviously they were unsuccessful. And they were not able to show their video that showed the conditions there at Smithfield.
And yet the jurors found Shung and Pinkelsheimer not guilty.
That's right. And, I was there for every minute of the trial. I can honestly say, I've been involved in animal protection for 20 plus years. It was one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen. It was riveting from start to finish. And, one of the interesting things was the prosecution's effort to get the video suppressed and not shown to the jury. I actually think it ended up backfiring on them in a huge way. There's two main reasons that it backfired. The first reason is that video actually did arguably show incriminating things. And the prosecution would have possibly been aided by being able to just point to that video. In fact, the prosecution called some witnesses to the stand, like an FBI agent who led the investigation, as well as a law enforcement officer from the Attorney General's office. Repeatedly, these witnesses would allude to the video. They would say, I saw Mr. Pinkelsheimer say in a video X, Y, and Z. And guess what, Emil? That would always elicit an objection from the defense based on hearsay grounds, because these witnesses can't say something they saw someone else say. You have to actually show the original evidence to the jury. So there was all of this evidence that the prosecution had planned to introduce from the video, but because they weren't allowed to show the video because of their own efforts to suppress the video, all that evidence couldn't be used. So that was the first way it hamstrung them. But the second way was, I didn't speak to any of these jurors, of course. I can't get into their minds. But I have a strong suspicion that these jurors didn't appreciate being treated like babies. And they knew that there were photographs and videos that they couldn't see. In fact, at one point, Wayne, who was representing himself and actually did brilliantly representing himself, he wanted to show a photograph of one of these piglets that he rescued trying to nurse on what was a bloody, mutilated teat from the mother pig. Basically to say, I know this piglet was going to die because she wasn't able to get milk from her mom. And that's how I knew this piglet was going to die. The judge actually made Wayne take this piece of paper with the photograph and cut around the mother pig, because they were allowed to show the jury the condition of the piglets, but no other pigs on the farm. And so the jury was handed this doctored, edited photograph of things cut around. And there were moments like that throughout the whole trial where the jury, who were all assumingly intelligent people, they could tell that there were facts they were not being told, images they were not being shown. At times, in fact, they even asked questions. The jurors were allowed to submit juror questions. And this happened repeatedly, and the judge refused to read them. The judge would say, I've looked at this question, I've decided is inappropriate. I'm sorry, I'm not reading it, because it was about animal welfare issues. So I think all of this effort to suppress the truth, actually put this jury in a position where they were like, we might be sending two people away to prison for a long time. It probably made them uncomfortable to make that decision knowing they weren't being told the whole story.
Yeah, and it's really strange because you go back to 5 years ago when this case happened in 2017, or not, when the actual incident occurred. The Direct Action Everywhere folks, DXE, Wayne Shung and Paul Darwin Pinkelsheimer, they were among 5 people to go into this facility owned by Smithfield Foods. And their sole purpose was just to document, just to take pictures of this, of the conditions there. And they were stopped because they saw 2 piglets that they felt compelled to save. And then they saved them. They called the 2 piglets Lily and Lizzie. And then they found that Smithfield, knowing that they were there, charged them with felony burglary. These are serious charges, serious jail time. Plus, there was also theft charges. So, what kind of time for the charges that were being, put forward against Shung and Pinkelsheimer? What kind of charge or what kind of jail time were they facing?
So, when the trial started, each defendant was facing 2 counts of burglary and 1 count of theft. And the reason they were each facing 2 counts of burglary is that the prosecution had alleged that they had entered 2 different buildings at the farm. They had entered a gestation barn, and they had also entered a farrowing barn. And for listeners who may not really know the difference between this, there's different buildings on a pig factory farm that each kind of represent a different stage of the life cycle of a pig. So inside the gestation barn, you have pregnant sows housed in stalls that are literally 2 feet by 7 feet. In fact, there's going to be a Supreme Court case later this week to rule on Prop 12 in California, which bans these inhumane cages. But they're used to circle for farms. They're kept in 2 feet by 7 feet. When the mothers give birth, the mom and the babies are moved to the farrowing barn, which those crates have slightly more space to allow room for the pigs to nurse until they're weaned. So they keep cycling through these different buildings until the mother pigs are quote unquote spent. So there were 2 different burglary counts there. And burglary, for those who don't know, the legal definition of burglary is basically unlawfully entering a building with the purpose of committing another crime. And in this case, that crime was theft. And you're right, it's a 3rd-degree felony. Burglary is in the state of Utah, which is punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Because there were 2 counts of burglary, these defendants were facing up to 10 years for the burglary charges. And, I have to tell you, after watching the whole proceedings, including some of the pretrial hearings, I feel like this judge was almost surely going to sentence them to some prison time. He didn't seem happy with the defendants. So the risk that these 2 people undertook, I can't overstate it. They were What they did was an incredibly brave thing. I also do know that at different stages they were given different plea offers, just as their co-defendants were, that almost surely would have meant they wouldn't have seen a single day in a jail cell. And they turned these offers down explicitly because they knew the statement that this would all make. And also, frankly, I think that they trusted the people and the jury to come to the right verdict, which they did. But it was an amazingly brave thing that they did, to face down 10 years in prison and still take it all the way to the end of trial.
They're trying to call attention to the way Smithfield Farms or Smithfield Foods does business. But these kind of cases come up, like just this week, there was the PETA expose. And by the way, DXE is not PETA, it's separate. But this kind of activity to expose factory farming has gone on for years. And PETA's expose of Plainville Farms just came down this week, where a local turkey supplier to top grocers like Wegmans and Publix and Harris Teeter, and the Pennsylvania State Police, they just charged 11 former workers with like 139 counts of cruelty to animals. And they did it because there was a PETA investigator's video.
And that's a remarkable thing. I mean, tragically, a lot of the abuse of animals that occurs on animal agriculture operations is perfectly legal. And, I'm not exactly sure what the law is in Pennsylvania, but in Utah, I can tell you that our cruelty to animals statute actually specifically exempts livestock. So these animals have no protection under Utah's law, which is one of the reasons that people like Wayne and Paul go to these lengths, and they have to risk jail time, because there's no other recourse really to try to get their suffering attended to, but to get the public to understand what's going on so we can get some needed changes in the law and get more awareness about this.
And to think that in Wayne and Paul's case, in DXE's case, they couldn't even use the video, whereas in Pennsylvania, they've got video of workers kicking and stomping turkeys. They've got birds who are sick and unable to walk. They've got all these pictures that are going to be part of this case. It's being called the largest number of charges in any factory farmed animal case in U.S. history. This case against Plainville Farms, and it's like 139 counts of cruelty to animals, including 6 felonies across 6 counties. This is a big deal with Plainville Farms. But as you can see, there's a lot of this. It's happening in Pennsylvania. It's happening in Utah. And yet, as we said at the beginning, this is indicative of how the factory farm industry doesn't want the public to understand what's going on.
That's right. And I mean, what PETA sounds like they are able to accomplish there in Pennsylvania is actually, in my opinion, kind of the exception, not the rule. I mean, it's very common that investigators will go in and document conditions of cruelty and abuse, because there's conditions of cruelty and abuse at every one of these farms every day of the week. And sadly, lots of times when animal advocates go on and gather this kind of evidence, you get the law enforcement officers involved. And one of the first questions at any time a law enforcement officer gets involved in an investigation, they ask themselves, okay, who are the parties here? Who are the victims? And who are the suspects? And in Utah's case, with Paul and Wayne's case, you had the FBI get involved, the Department of Justice, the Utah Attorney Generals. They saw the video of these two sick and dying piglets being saved, and they looked at what happened there at Smithfield, and unfortunately and corruptly, they looked at this all and they said that the victim here is Smithfield and that the suspects here are Paul and Wayne. So they started to build their case from that point. And then from that point, the evidence of mother sows being treated horribly, caged in small cages, that's not so good from the perspective of the alleged victim here, Smithfield. That only helps them. So they wanted to suppress that evidence. Whereas, what they wanted to try to introduce, what the prosecution repeatedly tried to do, was try to paint a picture of Paul and Wayne of being radical extremists. And, so that's kind of the narrative that they tried to go with. But like I said, I really think ultimately the way they approached this case really backfired on them.
And the fact that the direct action people won, that's another great thing, because it shows that people care about what's going on in those farms.
It does show that people care what's going on in these farms. And I think, again, yet another mistake that I think the prosecution made was they actually approached the jury with a rather callous view towards these animals. If I was sitting in the state's shoes and I wanted to actually try to prosecute this case, which I never would, but if I did, I think I would have at least tried to say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we understand that these defendants care about these animals and maybe they have some legitimate concerns, but there's a better, more lawful way to get those concerns addressed than what they did. Instead, what they did in the closing argument, Vaughn Christensen, the Beaver County attorney, actually went in front of the jury and said, this is no different than if these defendants had gone into a grocery store and saw some dented cans on the shelf and grabbed those cans off the shelf and said, this is a defective product, so I'm going to rescue it off the store shelf. And, I'm aware that at this point in time, being vegan and an animal rights position is still a bit of a minority position in this country. But I don't think viewing animals as the dented cans is anywhere close to the median position of where most Americans are. I think that they're still uncomfortable, even if they eat meat. They're uncomfortable with the idea that you'd compare a living, breathing, feeling animal to a dented can. And I thought that was, a crazy note for the state to rest its case on, to ask the jury to think of these piglets who now they know have names, are living in a sanctuary, healthy and free. They weren't getting veterinary care, all this stuff they knew. And the prosecution is asking them just to think of them like a dented can. And that was a bridge too far. And I think that's part of why they were acquitted.
And one of the things that I noted from your coverage and your coverage on your Twitter feed, and what was your Twitter feed again, Jeremy?
It's actually just my first and last name. At Jeremy Beckham is my Twitter. There also were awesome people from DXC tweeting from at Smithfield trial. So go check out both those Twitter feeds to kind of get a pretty detailed look at how the whole trial went.
Well, I noticed yours, and one thing I saw was the closing statement of Wayne Chung. And I thought his closing was very, very successful in bringing that empathy out. I mean, he really pretty much said, look, this is not a trial about burglary or theft. This is about whether or not people have the right, citizens have a right to save piglets who are dying.
Exactly. Honestly, Wayne's closing statement was one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen. Myself and most of the other people in the gallery that day were tearing up. I was having a hard time live tweeting it because I was just so moved by it. I just couldn't bring myself to do anything else but to listen. And, I thought one of the most moving things he said was, just like any good lawyer would do in a closing argument, he made a pretty long, detailed legal analysis about what property of value means. Because a lot of their legal argument hinged on that. In order for a theft to occur, it has to be property of value. But after he said that, he left the jury with this note where he said, at the end of the day, though, I actually don't want you to acquit me based on some technical legal argument or definition of value in the statute. I want you to acquit me because it's the right thing to do. And because you want to send a message here that corporations need to start listening and treating their animals better, and that authorities need to start investigating complaints of cruelty a little bit more. I thought that was very powerful. And, it's hard to get into the mind of the jurors. As far as I know, none of them have spoken publicly about how they reached their verdict. But I can't imagine that how powerful that was. It didn't resonate with at least a few of them. And I think it made a difference.
Wayne, just from the video I've seen, representing himself, his own attorney. Usually that's a bad thing.
Right.
Was there any point that you thought maybe that old saw that only a fool represents himself, or that's paraphrasing, but was there ever a moment that you thought, he should have had another attorney, he should have had someone else?
I will tell you that going into this trial, and Wayne, if you're listening, I'm sorry, but going into the trial, I thought Wayne was probably making a mistake doing that. After watching it all unfold, I think it was a smart decision. And, I think 99% of the time, what you just said is correct. People should not represent themselves. But I think this case was that 1%. I really do. I think it was an exceptional case. I also think it should be stated that, and part of that is just because Wayne was able to so effectively communicate why he was there. He is also a very skilled attorney. I think he's both a good advocate for himself legally, and he just represents himself well on an individual basis. And I will also mention Paul's attorney, Mary Corporon, based here in Salt Lake City. She did excellent as well. And I thought they made a great team. They each hit different notes in different ways. And I'm sure a lot of that was intended, that they each kind of played a different role. I thought it worked really well having Mary there representing Paul and Wayne representing himself. And, clearly it did, because they were acquitted.
Now, Wayne's got another case, you said, in another state. And so is it going to be a kind of a replay of this one? Because these are actions that are based on whistleblower complaints, right?
That's right. So Wayne does have another criminal case coming up. This one is going to be in Dane County, Wisconsin, which is where I used to live. That's where Madison, Wisconsin is. And a few years ago, Wayne and Paul and another person named Eva were involved in a rescue of beagle dogs from a facility that was breeding them for use in animal experimentation labs. And, I suggest everyone reading this, just do a Google search and they can find the Intercept article. Glenn Greenwald wrote a piece about this investigation of these beagle dogs who were taken from this facility that breeds them for deadly experiments that occur at labs all around the country, actually really around the world. One of the main customers of this breeder are actually labs in China. So they're bred in Wisconsin and then shipped to China. And so Dane County District Attorney has charged Wayne, Paul, and Eva for this alleged burglary as well. It's already gone to a preliminary hearing. So I do expect at this stage, I don't know for a fact, I'm not part of the legal team or the defense team, but it wouldn't surprise me to see in the future a trial for this case as well, related to Ridgeland Farms. That's the name of this facility in Wisconsin. And I'm sure there are some lessons that have been learned by all sides from this last trial, and it'll be really interesting to see.
As I said, PETA has been conducting these raids, back in the 90s and 92, and making some headway, but here we are, 2022, and there's still a lot of abuse, and people through the help of whistleblowers trying to expose that abuse. And it looks like every time you look, there's another case. When does the public sort of get it and say something's wrong with the factory farming industry?
Well, to be honest, I think a large segment of the public does get it, but there's not really very many opportunities for the public to weigh in and make an impact on shaping our policy. I mean, I don't think it's any secret that in this country, special interests have an outsized role in shaping policy and shaping our laws. And I can definitely speak to Utah, where I live, and the agricultural lobby here is absolutely huge. And you see that come into play, not just with treatment of animals, but with other issues. For example, our state's water usage. Here in Utah, the Great Salt Lake is starting to run dry. It's going to be an environmental catastrophe if and when that happens. The number one reason that the Great Salt Lake is running dry is they're diverting the 3 rivers that feed the Great Salt Lake in order to irrigate alfalfa farms. Why are we growing alfalfa in Utah? To feed livestock. So animal agriculture here is responsible for our water crisis in Utah, for the Great Salt Lake drying up. And yet our policymakers are doing almost nothing to address this huge waste of water And, I think the public would demand it, especially when they learn that a lot of this alfalfa we grow here actually gets exported to Saudi Arabia, to China, gets exported all around the world. So we're drying up our state to benefit corporations around the world. And I don't think if you put that on a ballot and said, vote on whether or not you think we should sacrifice the Great Salt Lake for cattle ranchers across the world, I think people would vote no. But we have a pretty corrupt system, and so it can be hard to and slow to make change. But I think it's happening, but it's just not as quick as we'd like.
And of course, we haven't even gotten to the animal abuse and the animal cruelty issues, which this case highlighted. This case also highlighted the fact that Smithfield Foods, well, I guess most people should know if they read the Wall Street Journal or any financial newspaper, they should know that Smithfield was bought out by the Chinese a few years back, and this is a Chinese company. And I think if people just think of Smithfield as the traditional American pig producer making your bacon and that kind of thing, I think they'd be surprised if this was a Chinese company.
Oh, I think so too. And I mean, there were indications throughout this entire case that not just the China-owned WH Group, which is who owns Smithfield, but also there were other corporations involved in pressuring the authorities to charge Wayne and Paul, including Costco, because Costco purchases a lot of the meat from Smithfield. And there was evidence that the FBI, one of the main reasons they were even involved in this case, was that a Costco executive was putting pressure on them because they said there was a quote unquote defamatory campaign against them. Okay. Well, the FBI is not supposed to be getting involved in cases of defamation. That's a civil matter. That's not a criminal matter. And yet the FBI answered the call and got 8 FBI agents involved to do a multi-state raid at animal sanctuaries looking for these 2 rescued piglets that the state itself said were worth $84. Okay. I have never seen 8 FBI agents in several states get involved in executing search warrants looking for $84 worth of property. Clearly, there was something bigger at stake here, and that was the image of these 2 huge influential corporations and putting their pressure on the authorities to protect that image. And honestly, it's scandalous. I actually think we need to have some investigations here from offices like the Inspector General's office to understand who exactly made the decision to even get involved in this at all on a federal level. It's a waste of resources.
So let's just backtrack a bit. The feds were involved, DOJ, FBI, even though this was really a Utah state case involving Attorney General Sean Reyes, who's an Asian American, Filipino American. He brought the case against these 2 activists, Shung and Picklesheimer, and the FBI got involved because of some corporate images had to be upheld.
That's certainly how it appears to any reasonable observer. Now, on paper, the FBI is supposed to predicate any official investigation on an apparent violation of federal law. I'm not exactly sure what the federal law was here that they thought was broken. It could have been the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, which is a horrific, overly broad law that they could have maybe used to predicate their investigation. But, the FBI was involved in obtaining 2 search warrants at 2 different animal sanctuaries. They actually did execute one of these warrants at a sanctuary where they believe these 2 pigs were living peacefully. They found one of these pigs there, and the FBI's people there actually cut off a section of this pig's ear while she was screaming and wriggling around so that they could run DNA analysis to see if that DNA matched the DNA of other pigs at Smithfield. All of this, again, for $84 worth of theft, even if you believe the state's case. So that's why I suggest to you, even if this may have violated, even if you believe that this was $84 worth of property, there is no way all of this effort would have been undertaken unless there was a bigger point here.
So the $84, that's 2 piglets valued at $42 and some odd cents. Now this case has gone to the jury, and Shung and Picklesheimer are found not guilty by the jury. What happens now? I mean, they go free. They never had any jail time, right?
Correct. They
Yeah.
never spent a single day in jail. And, what's amazing too is the prosecution made a lot of mistakes along the way. And I'm sure if they could go back in time, they would do things a little differently. But because they were so terrible at presenting their case and trying to convince a jury, now we have acquittals. And luckily, Wayne and Paul get to walk free. And we have a system in this country, which is wonderful, which says that we don't have double jeopardy. So they can't be charged anymore over this particular incident. Like I said, there is another case that both of these individuals are involved in out of Wisconsin of rescuing those dogs. And, I think we'll see what happens going forward. I definitely think that there will be a sense among people that this sets some sort of a precedence. It does not set a legal precedence. I want to emphasize that. Like it's not a legally binding precedence that future courts will use. And I also want people to know that a lot of it probably came down to this discussion about value. I suspect that was a big factor in how the jury reached their decision. And Paul and Wayne's argument there was, okay, you presented evidence that a piglet of this size is maybe worth $42, but that assumes the piglet was in good health or good condition. We found piglets who were severely malnourished, that had injuries to their legs, explosive diarrhea that was possibly pathogenic and therefore a liability to the farm. We all know that what Smithfield would have done, they would have immediately killed these piglets and throw their bodies into the dumpster, just like they do, by the way, thousands of times a year. Okay, Smithfield at this facility in Beaver, Utah, actually has their own landfill where they dump 18 million pounds of dead pigs every single year. I have no doubt Lily and Lizzie would have joined those 18 million pounds of pig flesh in that landfill if Wayne and Paul wouldn't have came in and rescued them there that day. So that's part of how they were able to achieve this remarkable verdict, is they were able to convince and demonstrate to the jury these particular piglets clearly had no further value to this company. They were just going to throw them away like trash.
And so basically, if there was no value, no case.
If there's no value, that means there's no theft. And if there's no theft, that means there's no burglary, because burglary is entering a structure plus a theft. You have to get all of those elements.
What does it say now about people who want to save animals in other contexts, in terms of factory farming or wherever they see cruelty?
Well, I do want to caution people a little bit. You need to be careful still. I don't want to say if you see pigs or other animals in dire circumstances, let's even make an analogy. You see a dog trapped in a hot car. If I saw a dog trapped in a hot car is about to die, I would smash that window and rescue that dog, even though that may be in some technical sense burglary of a vehicle. And so, sometimes your moral conscience just awakens you so much that you have to intervene and take action. That being said, what Wayne and Paul went through was still an ordeal. And I don't want people to have a cavalier attitude out there after this verdict that, people can just go and storm a factory farm and just start saving animals and not face any consequences. So I think it's an important milestone, and we'll see where it takes us over the next few years. And I think it will cause people to realize that we're starting to recognize even farm animals as having moral value and moral worth. I mean, the fact that 8 jurors, even in a conservative part of the country, were able to reach this verdict says something about the direction we're heading in this country. But it's not at all like a legal license, to start going into places of abuse and saving the animals, as much as I would like it to be the case.
Yeah.
That isn't quite what happened.
Or this all came out of a whistleblower, right? Is that how Direct Action Network knew that they should go in to this facility because piglets were in distress?
The origins of the investigation are that Smithfield had previously promised to get rid of gestation crates. I don't remember the exact year, but it was sometime around 10 years ago. They said, we're in the process of phasing out gestation crates at our facilities. Somewhere along the line, a whistleblower had reached out and said, Smithfield is breaking their promise. We have inside information that indicates to us there are still gestation crates in their barns, and they have no plans to phase those out. And the reality is, one of the only ways to even figure that out is by going and seeing it with your own eyes. It's not like this process is regulated by any state or federal authority. People are shocked to learn, but there is no federal law whatsoever that governs the treatment of animals while they are on a farm. When they go to a slaughterhouse, there are some food safety regulations governing the slaughter process, but raising animals on a farm, there's no federal law. And in Utah, there's no state law either. And even in some states like California, where you pass something like Prop 12, that's under fire from the industry, and the Supreme Court may be striking that down as well. So, that's why these whistleblowers are so important, because the authorities are not doing their job at all. Our system is failing these animals. So we need the whistleblowers and we need the investigators like Wayne and Paul to go out there and take the risks so the public can learn what's happening, because I think we all have a right to know.
And that really is the bottom line. Like we said at the beginning of this, when there was that protester who went on the field in Monday Night Football to let people know. But even that was censored by the corporate media. ESPN would not show it. And they would talk about, they thought he was a streaker. They thought he was whatever. But social media and some other media outlets did show that these protesters were linked to the direct action everywhere folks and linked to this trial. More people have found out about it, as the New York Times has reported on the situation. So you got to think that the word is getting out, but I guess ultimately it's really up to people to take make the big decision to stop eating meat and go vegan, really.
That's exactly right. Because at the end of the day, all of these corporations, for all of the evilness of what they're doing and how much they're trying to suppress the truth, they also wouldn't be in business if on the consumer side, people weren't demanding that they produce a product. So I think the way to stop this horrific injustice is really to have a multi-pronged approach to try to cut down their power and their influence in our government and our policy. But also we need to take the floor out from underneath them by cutting into their profits, by refusing to buy their products. Okay. I view veganism as really a form of boycott. I would never purchase an animal product because I wouldn't want to support these industries and their continued growth. It's actually a very similar thing too to what happened, by the way, with tobacco corporations. Tobacco corporations had a lot more power and influence in this country when there were more smokers. When the number of smokers started to go down in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, suddenly the economic power of the tobacco corporations, even the cultural power of these tobacco corporations started to lessen because they weren't supplying a product for as many people. So that's obviously one easy thing that any one of us can do, is to go vegan, stop buying these products, stop giving animal agriculture our dollars, and we will start to see their power diminish based on that as well.
Well, Jeremy Beckham, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking about this case. I know you've been an activist for a long time, and it kind of surprises me that there are moments in this case that you were really touched by what these two activists, Wayne Shung and Paul Pinkelsheimer, were what they were facing, what they were and what they had the courage to stand up to.
Yeah, Paul and Wayne, they have a courage and a bravery that is, very rare to see. They really were staring down significant prison time. I can tell you, knowing them personally, they were both preparing, even in their own personal lives, to go to prison, figuring out who was going to take care of their animals while they're away. So this was a very real possibility to them. And even staring that down, they did the right thing. They stood up for the animals and gave the whole movement this amazing victory.
Now, Jeremy, before I let you go, this isn't over yet here in Beaver County, in Utah.
That's right. It's not. And that's because Direct Action Everywhere and Utah Animal Rights Coalition, the local animal advocacy group here, have actually filed a federal lawsuit against Beaver County Sheriff's Office and other Beaver County figures down there. Because back in July, we were just trying to conduct some outreach to people in the community to let them know about the trial that was happening, let them know about the factory farming practice in Smithfield. And the sheriff's office actually told us to leave town, told us to stop immediately on threat of arrest. And we have a First Amendment right to be there. Our people were on the sidewalk talking to willing participants who wanted to engage us in conversation. So we filed a lawsuit. We retained an excellent civil rights attorney here in Salt Lake City named Kara Porter, and we have our first court date trying to get a preliminary injunction against Beaver County that basically tells Beaver County, you need to knock this off. You need to let people speak. And so I think there's going to be something very poetic about this all, because just last week I was there in St. George and the animal advocates were on defense. They were fighting for their very freedom against the power of the state. And now this week in federal court, the tables have completely turned and we're on offense against Beaver County as they, try to make some kind of argument that what they were doing wasn't infringing on our rights. And so, we're not just going to protect our own freedom in criminal cases. We're also going to protect our rights in federal court to make sure that we still have free speech to tell as many people as we can about these horrific practices happening at Circle 4 Farms.
Well, Jeremy, keep us apprised of what happens. I appreciate you telling us, and I appreciate you being on the PETA podcast.
Thank you, Emil.
Jeremy Beckham, animal rights activist, frequent PETA podcast guest, who covered the trial last week of Direct Action Everywhere, DXE, founder Wayne Shung and Paul Picklesheimer, both acquitted of burglary and theft 5 years after entering a Smithfield factory farm and rescuing 2 piglets. The piglets are fine, but the fight against factory farms continues. PETA's been documenting abuses on factory farms since the early 90s in cases like the Hormel investigation that resulted in convictions for abuse and neglect of farmed pigs. But of course, the best strategy in the fight against factory farms is simply for all of you to go vegan. For more on factory farming abuses and for information to help you go vegan, go to PETA.org. And that's our show for today. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to send a link of this show to your friends and tell them you like the PETA podcast. You can contact us at PETA.org. You can find me on Twitter at Emil Amok. That's EMILAMOK. Or see my vlog at AMOK.com. Or see my work at ALDEF, the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That's ALDEF, AALDEF.org/blog. Once again, thank you for listening. Check out all our episodes on your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts, where you can subscribe to as well as rate and review the show. It helps get the word out about the issues you care about. Our music is provided by Carbonworks. Check them out on YouTube. And join us again next time for more insight into animal rights on the PETA Podcast. I'm Emil Guillermo.